We moved to a town next to the city of Indianapolis in the U.S. state of Indiana when I was about 4.5 years old. I'm not sure if we were more of a suburb or small town culturally. We lived on the edge of farm country and lived there for 7 years. In some ways, I have fond memories, and in other ways, I don't. I've said my experience of the U.S., except for the state of Louisiana, is of a realism sort of way. I'm comparing, in my experience, the difference between what to me is a culture of realism versus one of magical realism. Realism is what I mostly grew up around. It was my base, and magical realism was my mother's culture of Louisiana. It was my 2.5 years of living in Panama, and my fascination with South America growing up. Indiana was the place most strongly based in realism of any place I lived. It is the place I lived the longest during my formative years. I describe realism to mean everything is black and white. You were taught to be skeptical and to not believe many things. There are no areas of gray, either in life or in academics. You were taught the realism way of thinking is the best approach, and anything else is less. There is no debate in it. There was the belief that all their ideologies were correct and superior. I suppose, to its credit at the time, the most powerful nations were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries. Their achieved power is what led them to believe they were superior in all ways. It is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries that I referred to as having realist cultures. The thinking was also in a scientific direction. Alternative ways of thinking were really not tolerated. It was mathematical, unemotional. Our town was virtually 100% white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or white Anglo-Saxon Catholic. That is, the people were of English, Scandinavian, and German descent. There were 2 exceptions, as far as I knew. Our family was one, having a Polish last name, and another family was African American, which a boy who was part of that family was one of my best friends. I've heard that the family of my friend was essentially ran out of town for being African American. I watched my friend, while he was still there, suffer from prejudice and was glad when he moved. He and his family were very strong, but those conditions were awful. I was glad to see no one else from another race or non-European ethnicity moved there, as it would have been awful for them. I was glad because I knew it wasn't going to change. The hatred was too strong. I grew up Catholic, but Catholics were considered inferior to Protestants in most of the United States. David Goggins has accomplished many things no other human has, and is best known for being a SEAL. SEALs are widely known as the most demanding and capable of the military special forces. David wrote a book called You Can't Hurt Me. He is from the same area I am, west of Indianapolis, Indiana. He talks about how horrible he was treated growing up there, and in his case, for being African American. I'm surprised that David Goggins, his mother, and I believe it was his brother, were allowed to live where they lived. In many places across the U.S., it was common for African American families to be chased out of town. The threat was often of lynching or other forms of death. I think what may have been different is David's mother had left his father. I believe had David's father been with his family, the family wouldn't have been allowed to stay. Racism or bigotry is another strong component of what I am describing as realism. I suppose racism exists across the world, but realism is my main culture. It is my culture that I saw this tremendous amount of racism. David has used the emotional pain to fuel all he does as much as anyone I know. But despite all the accomplishments, the emotional pain, to me, seems very present each time I hear him speak. My experiences, of course, don't compare, but to his, but in some ways, were similar. I was good at making friends when I was quite young, but adults mostly thought quite a bit less of me. I would be judged harshly by adults because of my last name, even from my teachers. The only one of my teachers in Indiana who treated me well was the gym teacher. This may have been because of my athletic skills. There were a number of physical tests we were given, and he told me the results of my test ranked me as one of the top students in the United States. I was a good student, but I rebelled against the way the teachers treated me. I often got into trouble. I knew I couldn't go over to some of the houses of my friends because I was Polish. Their parents didn't allow it. I knew that some of the students thought less of me for being Polish, but for the most part, because I was really good at athletics, I was accepted. Had I not been very good in athletics or fighting, which I was also good at, I would have been viewed negatively by most of my classmates. Ethnicity or race wasn't the only prejudice they had there. One was harshly judged on nearly everything: family wealth, intelligence, beauty, athleticism, popularity, etc. To not be of this meant you were far inferior. The young boys fought, and fought a lot. It was almost a metaphor. The struggle to be near perfect in the traits I mentioned was a fight for our lives. I think the constant pressure of this led us to be violent with one another out of frustration. We fought almost daily. I am sure I must have been in hundreds of fights in Indiana. It would never grow more violent than that, meaning as those kids became older, they generally would not use weapons in their fights or become criminals. I also believe this was a young age phenomena. I think by a certain age, one just accepted who one was. They were no longer trying to prove they were something they were not. If someone was less than perfect in every area, society encouraged us to make fun of them. Our teachers encouraged it. If someone was not as smart, poorer, less attractive, less athletic, less popular, then it was your obligation to belittle them. It was a miserable philosophy. For the most part, there was not much of a difference in economic status in this Indiana town. There were some rich, there were some poor, but the vast majority were middle class. To me, this was the culture of realism. There was only one way to be, or only one acceptable way. Emotions, enjoyment of life, were really not a consideration. It was, of course, a cold culture. People were distant. I found a magical realist culture to be far warmer and a part of my attraction to it. I found this to be true in their religion as well. I don't believe anything existed outside of Protestant or Catholic Christianity there. The teaching was of a disappointed, distant, and uncaring God. This is what I was taught. I was taught if we lived a perfect spiritual life, then God would accept us, but anything else was unacceptable. Even if you lived a perfect spiritual life, you might at times be punished because of the sins of the masses. I would ride my bike, often for hours at a time, observing all that was going on. I saw many things on those rides. I saw a person murdered. I saw fathers beating their children. I saw people getting beaten up. I got beaten up. I saw crimes. Among other things, I saw was a generally uncaring community. Maybe this exposure on my bike wasn't good for someone as young as I was, but I had to witness and learn all that was. I had to understand. It led me to question why things had to be this way. Why was it acceptable for people to treat each other poorly and to consider others to be inferior? Another portion of this culture was the lack of community. That is both in family and extended community. I believe a core of the American society is about the individual. This contrasts strongly to many of the world's cultures in that they are much more communal. This means they are much more part of a community. In the U.S., a viewpoint is that the individual is responsible for their own survival, and an inability to do this is nothing less than a character flaw and a lack of worthiness. The next cultural episode will be about my experiences in the state of Michigan and my comparison of its culture to realism. I will probably first do one of my trip to South America in witnessing a massacre. Please subscribe and like, as that is how YouTube sends it on to others. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.